The palace was calm. Too calm. Sunlight poured through centuries-old windows, gilding the marble floors, painting portraits of monarchs long gone. Every footstep, every rustle of silk, was a note in a centuries-old symphony of ceremony. And then a shift, not a shout, not a crash, but a subtle flicker, a glance too sharp, a breath held a fraction too long. In that fraction of a second, the air thickened. The royal guard, trained for a lifetime to see the invisible, felt it immediately. The silent signal of danger. Hands moved, eyes locked, postures adjusted. Guests remained oblivious. A princess stood poised, unaware that seconds from now, a decision would define her safety and test the limits of centuries of protocol. A man approached, credentials in hand, calm in appearance, but carrying a threat that history would barely record. One guard, one heartbeat, one movement would decide the difference between disaster and dignity. Because inside these walls, courage often goes unseen. Valor has no applause. And sometimes the line between order and chaos is measured not in minutes, but in instinct. The palace was calm, but the calm was fragile. Sunlight fell through tall, sash windows, stretching across polished marble floors that had carried the weight of monarchs for centuries. Every sound, the quiet shuffle of shoes, the gentle swish of silk, the muted breath of those gathered, became amplified, measured against history itself. Catherine, Princess of Wales, stood beneath the gaze of her ancestors' portraits, poised yet human, a figure of disciplined elegance in a room designed to impress but also to protect. Guests, senior royals, and aides were present, their faces formal, composed, yet unknowingly suspended on the edge of tension. Then the shift came. Not a shout, not a crash, a breath held, a hand adjusting a glove, a posture fractionally altered. The royal guard at the eastern archway noticed immediately. Years of training had sharpened senses beyond ceremony. He did not move hastily. He calculated. A subtle signal, almost invisible to untrained eyes, betrayed intent. A temporary contractor badge, issued under unusual authorization, gleamed faintly in the light. The man stepped forward, one stride too confident, one gesture too deliberate. The guard's response was instantaneous. His movement, measured, precise, placed it between the princess and the potential threat. Gloves clasped, stance locked, eyes unyielding. The human shield of centuries of protocol activated without hesitation. Guests froze. Catherine, poised, did not move. Trust was implicit, embodied in the invisible choreography of protection. A document fell to the floor. Soft gasps rippled through the room. Yet outwardly, order remained. Conversations resumed. Music continued. Composure restored. But beneath the palace's ceremonial calm, alarms had been felt, judgments made, and history nearly rewritten in the space of one heartbeat. But what no one yet understands is how this threat reached so close, and whether it was truly sudden or quietly engineered from within the palace walls. Hours later, behind the stone walls of the palace, the echoes of the afternoon's near incident still lingered, subtle, almost imperceptible, but heavy with implication. The gallery had returned to ceremonial calm, yet somewhere in the palace's hidden arteries, the machinery of security was humming with scrutiny. Clearance logs, access protocols, and the silent oaths of generations were suddenly under the microscope. The royal guard who had acted so decisively remained at his post, outwardly unchanged, but internally reviewing every microsecond of the encounter. Years of service outside Buckingham Palace had honed his instincts, and tonight, in private chambers, they were being dissected not as instinct but as procedure. Investigators began tracing every angle. Camera feeds rewound frame by frame, guest registries cross-checked against security authorizations. Every door, every corridor, every badge swiped or glanced became a node in an intricate network of protection. And in the minutiae, a deviation emerged. A temporary contractor badge, issued under unusual authorization, had allowed the intruder proximity that should have been impossible. Senior officials debated discretion versus disclosure. Who had approved the expedited clearance? And why? One mid-level signature, ordinarily buried in bureaucratic routine, now threatened the integrity of centuries-old protocols. Intelligence officers whispered in corners, highlighting procedural gaps that the public would never see. The Royalty and Specialist Protection Unit examined patterns of access, timing, and alignment, noting that the breach had followed no random path, but a carefully measured one. Meanwhile, the guard's own record, impeccable, silent, and unassuming, became the fulcrum of investigation. His instincts had not only prevented harm, but revealed the subtle coding of threat. Gestures, micro-expressions, timing deviations, all invisible to those untrained in observation. Every move he had made now carried weight beyond the immediate moment. Documents, once unremarkable, were scrutinized. Temporary clearances issued without the usual chain of oversight raised questions that transcended the day's events. Was this administrative oversight or deliberate testing of the palace's internal defenses? And if deliberate, by whom and for what purpose? Minutes became hours. The palace itself seemed to hold its breath. Corridors silent, but eyes everywhere scanning, reviewing, calculating. Each officer, each aide, each official understood that the surface calm could be deceiving. Beneath the gold leaf and ceremonial order, the framework of trust had been tested. A subtle fissure revealing vulnerabilities long assumed to be unbreakable. Yet even as analysis deepened, a quiet tension spread to the palace hierarchy. Decisions made in private, signatures signed in haste, minor procedural deviations. Any one of them could have escalated the day's near crisis into catastrophe. Loyalty, protocol, and instinct were now intertwined, tangled in questions of accountability and foresight. Through every camera lens, document, and hallway, the question remained: who had quietly enabled the intruder, intentionally or by accident? And would the palace, steeped in centuries of tradition, be able to reconcile the layers of trust breached in those fleeting moments? The breach may appear administrative, but one overlooked signature on a heritage document threatens to unravel more than a single afternoon's safety. The council chamber was silent, but the weight of the day pressed against every panel wall. Outside, the afternoon sun still cast long shadows across Kensington Palace, but within, time seemed suspended. The air smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, of history and duty intermingled. Every seat was filled. Palace officials, senior security advisors, aides, and family members, each poised with the discipline that centuries of protocol demanded, yet internally questioning everything they had trusted. Prince William sat rigid, fingers pressed against the edge of the polished oak table, his gaze steady yet unyielding. Questions hovered in the air like smoke. How had a temporary clearance allowed proximity to Catherine? Was this breach a simple lapse or a calculated probe? Every officer in the room felt the moral gravity. The crown had been exposed, if only for a heartbeat and accountability now pressed upon them like an invisible hand. Catherine, composed and deliberate, sat slightly apart, her expression neutral yet attentive. She absorbed every word, every nuance, her poise a shield that the family had come to rely upon. But even in stillness, her mind raced, tracking the invisible threads of loyalty and risk that wove through the palace's corridors. She knew instinct had saved her, yet instinct alone could not explain why or how the vulnerability had emerged. Evidence was laid bare. Camera footage, access logs, security signatures, all revealed not randomness, but method. The man at the gallery had moved with precision, testing reactions, mapping response times, assessing vulnerabilities. Frame by frame, the guard's intervention replayed. Not a single movement wasted, each adjustment preemptive, each step controlled. Observers noted the moment he recognized a subtle gesture, a coded signal of intent, long before anyone else registered the threat. Discussion in the chamber oscillated between admiration and unease. Some advisors praised the guard's decisive action. Others questioned whether it had contravened standing orders. Loyalty, they argued, demanded obedience. Yet obedience sometimes conflicts with survival. The moral calculus was delicate. The line between protocol and intuition, between honor and recklessness, blurred in real time. Minutes stretched into tense deliberation. Every word carried consequence. The guard, silent at the edge of the room, maintained the same composure he displayed in the gallery. Yet internally, he recalculated every possibility, understanding that even a success could invite scrutiny. A hero, yes, but a hero who had bent the rules. And in this palace, rules were as sacred as life itself. Outside, the corridors remained still, but the palace itself seemed to breathe, anticipating the ripple effects. The intruder's path had revealed cracks, temporary authorizations, overlooked signatures, lapses in oversight. Each was now a node under investigation, each a potential breach of trust. And through it all, Catherine remained the anchor. Her dignity, her patience, her calm. It was more than public composure. It was a silent recognition that the guard's action, while technically outside protocol, had preserved not just her safety but the fragile continuity of the monarchy itself. The chamber began to close discussions, yet no one left without the understanding that the incident was not merely a test of security, but a test of character. Who would follow orders? Who would act on instinct? Who would weigh loyalty against moral responsibility? And most importantly, how would the crown reconcile the tension between centuries-old tradition and the immediacy of life-or-death decisions? Yet his decision, though heroic, may have quietly violated a standing order, and loyalty to the crown sometimes demands obedience over intuition. The paneled chamber smelled of aged wood, faint polish, and the quiet weight of history. Portraits of generals, royal advisors, and soldiers in ceremonial dress lined the walls, their eyes seemingly tracking every movement. Here, decisions were weighed not just in words, but in centuries of precedent, a place where loyalty, honor, and duty collided in silence. The guard who had intervened remained under internal review. His movements that day were dissected in meticulous detail, frame by frame, decision by decision. Minutes stretched into hours as senior officials examined memoranda, access logs, and communications that had passed unnoticed. Intelligence briefings, once considered routine, now held ominous relevance. Warnings had circulated weeks earlier, subtle mentions of anomalies, of unusual activity tied contractors and logistical staff. They had been downplayed. Preservation of ceremony had outweighed caution. Catherine was informed privately, alone in her study. She considered the invisible burdens carried by those sworn to protect her, men and women who moved through corridors unseen, who assessed threats before any eyes noticed, whose courage existed without audience or applause. She understood now more deeply the fragility beneath the gilded surface of her world. A sealed report revealed the origin of the temporary contractor badge, an outsourced vendor, historically flagged for security concerns, had been granted expedited access without typical oversight. Every signature, every procedural allowance was scrutinized, and the palace command began to grasp a precarious balance between tradition and vulnerability. The chamber's shadows seemed to deepen as officials realized the truth. The afternoon's threat was not isolated. It was a fragment of a broader design, subtle and carefully orchestrated. Intelligence annexes, once unopened, now whispered hints of patterns beyond immediate comprehension. Movements, approvals, and tests of response that extended far beyond the gallery where Catherine had stood. The guard, ever silent, maintained his poise, yet internally he grappled with the implications. His actions had preserved life, but they had also illuminated fractures in the very systems he served. Each layer of bureaucracy, each protocol, each moment of discretion was a line that had almost been crossed, a fault line beneath centuries of carefully maintained trust. Catherine reflected, alone, on the paradox of her existence, surrounded by symbols of permanence, yet constantly reminded that vigilance was ephemeral. Tradition was a shield, yes, but it could not replace judgment. Courage, instinct, and awareness were required to navigate a world where invisible threats moved as freely as ceremonial pageantry. Outside the chamber, the palace continued its daily rhythm, unaware of the revelations unfolding within. The corridors were quiet, yet within their stillness, the weight of unseen danger lingered. History would record the afternoon as uneventful, ceremonial, even ordinary. But inside, decisions were being catalogued, judgments measured, and the very line between preservation and peril studied with relentless attention. When a classified intelligence annex is finally opened, it reveals that the afternoon's threat was only a fragment of a broader design, one that has not yet been fully contained. The palace corridors, once thick with tension and whispered speculation, had returned to measured order. Polished marble reflected soft afternoon light, the echo of footsteps now steady, disciplined, predictable. The incident, though never fully publicized, had left traces, subtle shifts in procedure and watchfulness, in the way the palace's custodians of tradition moved through their duties. The security lapse was addressed quietly. No public announcement, no ceremonial recognition. Disciplinary measures were implemented behind closed doors, precise, methodical, and deliberate. Every signature, every memorandum, every reassignment reinforced the delicate equilibrium of palace operations. The machinery of tradition had reasserted itself, but with adjustments informed by the day's stark reminder, vigilance cannot be assumed. It must be renewed continuously. The guard who had acted decisively received no headlines, no accolades. His heroism existed only in the margins of palace records, entered into confidential logs where deeds of courage were catalogued without spectacle. Catherine requested a private acknowledgement, a brief expression of gratitude that conveyed respect without ceremony. Her words, quiet but profound, recognized the personal dimension of duty that transcends protocol. Courage performed without audience is still valor. Loyalty expressed in silence is still fidelity. Prince William observed the adjustments and the recognition in private, emphasizing to advisors and staff that the strength of the monarchy was not in grandeur, but in the quiet endurance of its principles. Every gesture, every protocol, every unseen decision reflected the relentless pursuit of security, honor, and continuity. The palace itself seemed to exhale, its centuries-old rhythms resuming with careful precision, yet tempered now by lessons learned in real time. As order reestablished itself, those who served understood a deeper truth. History is shaped not only by the grand ceremonies captured in portraits and records, but by the act of unseen individuals who choose decisiveness over hesitation, judgment over rigidity. These acts, though invisible to the public eye, reinforce the crown in ways both profound and enduring. In the galleries and corridors, Catherine resumed her public duties with calm determination, a living emblem of poise and composure. Her presence reinforced the idea that the monarchy's resilience lies as much in discretion as in spectacle. The world will continue to see ceremonial stability, unaware of the silent courage that preserved it. And as calm returns to palace corridors, one question lingers. How many acts of unseen courage shape history without ever being told? The palace had returned to its outward serenity. Sunlight filtered through high windows, dust motes drifting lazily in the golden beams. The corridors, polished and silent, carried the faint echo of footsteps, the careful rhythm of those who serve unseen. To the casual observer, nothing had changed. To those who knew the layers beneath the gilded surface, everything had shifted. The royal guard, in scarlet and gold, resumed his post. Immovable in ceremony, yet profoundly human, he carried the invisible weight of every decision made in the fractions of a second that day. Every second counted. Every choice mattered. Courage, he understood, was not measured by applause, and loyalty was not validated by recognition. The contract between protector and sovereign is sacred precisely because it requires trust without witness. Catherine moved through public duties with the same composure that had become her signature. Smiles, handshakes, formal engagements, all the world would see was elegance, poise, and continuity. Yet behind each gesture was a quiet knowledge of how narrowly harm had been averted. Tradition endures, she reflected, not by accident, but because individuals choose duty over fear, instinct over hesitation, principle over comfort. The palace itself seemed to breathe with a history of countless silent acts. Every guard, every aide, every unseen hand that maintained order contributed to the living legacy of the monarchy. Their service was measured not in headlines, but in the unbroken chain of vigilance. The tapestry of the crown is woven from these invisible threads, strong yet delicate, resilient yet reliant on human choice. In the quiet of her private chambers, Catherine paused to reflect on the day's lessons. The public knew ceremonies, portraits, and rituals. They did not know the courage required to sustain them. History remembered only what was recorded, yet it is shaped equally, often more profoundly, by decisions made in private, by loyalty exercised without notice, by courage performed in silence. And as the palace settled into evening, the shadows lengthening across marble floors and ornate ceilings, the lesson remained clear. The weight of service is heavy precisely because it is unseen. The monarchy survives, not by spectacle alone, but by those who act decisively, quietly, and without expectation of reward. Tomorrow, we uncover another untold moment, when a single decision inside palace walls reshaped the destiny of the crown itself.